The question came during a quiet Saturday morning breakfast in June, when Ronaldo's 12-year-old son, Cristiano Jr., set down his orange juice and looked directly at his father with the kind of serious expression that children wear when they're processing something they've heard or seen that doesn't align with what they've been taught about treating all people with respect and kindness. And when he asked why some people seemed to hate Muslims, when the Muslim people he knew were good and nice, Ronaldo realized that his son had been observing social dynamics and media coverage that had forced him to confront prejudice and discrimination in ways that required careful explanation about complex historical and political issues that were difficult for adults to navigate, let alone children, who were trying to understand why religious differences seemed to generate fear and hostility among people who claim to believe in values like tolerance and equality. The timing of Cristiano Jr.'s question was significant because it came just days after he had overheard conversations between his father and teammates about discrimination that Muslim players faced in some stadiums, where fans directed racist chants and hostile behavior toward athletes whose religion was treated as a target for abuse, rather than a personal belief that deserved the same respect afforded to other forms of religious expression. And his confusion about this hatred was compounded by his positive relationships with Muslim classmates, coaches, and family friends, whose character and behavior contradicted the negative stereotypes that seemed to motivate prejudice against people whose faith he had learned to see as one of many different ways that people express their spiritual beliefs and cultural identities. Ronaldo's response required careful consideration because he wanted to provide an honest explanation that acknowledged the reality of Islamophobia while avoiding oversimplification that might lead his son to develop his own prejudices or fears about religious and cultural differences that were actually sources of richness and diversity rather than threats to community safety or social harmony. And he began by affirming that his son's observations were correct, that the Muslim people they knew personally were indeed good and kind individuals whose religion taught them to value compassion, charity, and social justice in ways that were consistent with the moral principles that their own family tried to practice in their daily lives and charitable work. The explanation that followed was necessarily complex, involving discussion of historical conflicts, political manipulation of religious differences, and the ways that fear and ignorance could be exploited by leaders who benefited from dividing communities against each other, rather than encouraging understanding and cooperation that might reduce their power to control populations through manufactured threats and artificial divisions that prevented people from recognizing their common interests and shared humanity that transcended religious and cultural boundaries, that were often emphasized to obscure economic and political inequalities that affected everyone, regardless of their faith or background. Cristiano Jr.'s follow-up questions revealed both his intelligence and his moral development as he struggled to understand how people could judge entire groups based on the actions of individuals, why religious differences seemed to generate more hostility than other forms of diversity, and whether the prejudice he had observed was similar to the racism that he had learned about in school when studying historical examples of discrimination that had been used to justify slavery, segregation, and other forms of systematic oppression that violated basic principles of human dignity and equal treatment under law that democratic societies claim to protect and defend. The conversation evolved into a broader discussion about the difference between individual behavior and group identity, with Ronaldo explaining that judging all Muslims based on the actions of a few extremists was no different from judging all Christians based on the behavior of people who had committed violence in the name of Christianity, or judging all athletes based on the misconduct of players who had violated ethical standards that most professionals maintained throughout their careers. And this comparison helped his son understand that fairness required evaluating people as individuals, rather than assuming that shared characteristics automatically determined personal qualities or behaviors that varied enormously within any group, regardless of religious, ethnic, or cultural affiliations. The examples that Ronaldo provided drew from their own experiences with Muslim friends and colleagues whose generosity, integrity, and kindness, contradicted negative stereotypes that were promoted by media coverage and political rhetoric that emphasized conflict and division rather than cooperation and mutual respect, that characterized most actual relationships between people from different religious backgrounds who interacted in schools, workplaces, and communities where practical collaboration was more important than theological differences that rarely affected daily activities or professional relationships that were based on competence and character rather than religious affiliation. Cristiano Jr.'s concern about how to respond when he heard people making negative comments about Muslims revealed his developing sense of moral responsibility and his desire to act in ways that were consistent with family values, about treating all people with dignity and respect. And Ronaldo explained that speaking up against prejudice was important but needed to be done thoughtfully and safely, with emphasis on presenting facts and personal experiences that could counter stereotypes rather than engaging in arguments that might escalate conflict without changing anyone's mind or improving understanding between people whose differences of opinion reflected deeper issues about fear, education, and exposure to diverse perspectives. The role-playing exercises that followed helped Cristiano Jr. practice responses to discriminatory comments that he might encounter at school or in social situations where friends or classmates expressed prejudiced views about Muslims or other minority groups. And these practice sessions emphasize the importance of remaining calm while providing alternative perspectives based on personal knowledge and factual information, rather than emotional reactions that might make conversations more confrontational rather than educational. And Ronaldo stressed that changing minds was a gradual process that required patience and persistence, rather than dramatic confrontations that might feel satisfying but were unlikely to produce lasting changes in attitude or behavior. The educational component of their conversation included age-appropriate information about Islamic history, contributions to science and culture, and the diversity of Muslim communities around the world that contradicted simplistic stereotypes about a religion that included people from dozens of different countries, ethnic backgrounds, and cultural traditions that were unified by shared spiritual beliefs, but varied enormously in their practices, interpretations, and integration with local customs that had evolved over centuries of interaction between Islamic principles and regional cultures that had created rich traditions of art, literature, philosophy, and social organization. The practical aspects of their discussion focused on how Cristiano Jr. could demonstrate respect for Muslim classmates and friends through simple actions like learning about their holidays and traditions, defending them against discriminatory comments, and including them in social activities without making assumptions about their interests or abilities based on their religious identity. And Ronaldo emphasized that true friendship required seeing people as complete individuals rather than representatives of their religious or cultural groups, while also showing interest in learning about differences that could enrich everyone's understanding of the world's diversity and complexity. The family commitment that emerged from their conversation involved establishing regular discussions about prejudice, discrimination, and social justice issues that would help Cristiano Jr. develop critical thinking skills about media coverage, political rhetoric, and social dynamics that could influence his attitudes toward different groups of people. And these ongoing conversations were designed to ensure that he remained aware of bias and discrimination while developing confidence in his ability to think independently about complex social issues, rather than simply accepting popular opinions or stereotypes that might be widespread but were not necessarily accurate or fair. The charitable dimension of their discussion led to increased family involvement in organizations that supported Muslim communities facing discrimination, including refugee assistance programs, interfaith dialogue initiatives, and educational projects that promoted understanding between different religious groups while addressing practical needs like legal assistance, language training, and employment support that helped new immigrants and marginalized communities integrate successfully into broader society while maintaining their cultural and religious identities that enriched rather than threatened community diversity. The school presentation that Cristiano Jr. eventually gave about religious tolerance and the contributions of Muslim civilization was inspired by their conversation and demonstrated his growing understanding of how individual actions could contribute to reducing prejudice and promoting understanding. And his research into Islamic achievements in mathematics, medicine, astronomy, and other fields provided his classmates with information that countered negative stereotypes while illustrating the universal nature of human creativity and innovation that transcended religious and cultural boundaries that were often emphasized to create artificial divisions between people whose actual interests and values were more similar than different. Years later, when Cristiano Jr. had grown into a young man whose commitment to social justice and religious tolerance had been shaped by that breakfast conversation and the ongoing discussions that had followed, when he had become an advocate for interfaith understanding and civil rights, who used his platform as Ronaldo's son to promote equality and respect for diversity, he would credit his father not with providing all the answers about complex social issues, but with taking his questions seriously enough to engage in honest conversations about difficult topics that many adults preferred to avoid, rather than helping young people develop the critical thinking skills and moral courage needed to challenge prejudice and discrimination wherever they encountered it in their personal and professional lives.